An arrogant young lieutenant mocks an old man in uniform, calling him just a washed-up relic. The cafeteria laughs until the doors swing open and a decorated general storms in, eyes burning with fury. The old man's name? Colonel Arthur Hale, his father. "Lieutenant," the general growls, "you just humiliated the man who taught me everything about honor." The cafeteria fell silent the moment Lieutenant Blake Carson's voice cut through the air. "Is that how you wear a uniform, old man?" he barked, his boots echoing sharply against the polished floor. Every head in the room turned. The veterans, men whose faces carried decades of sacrifice, froze mid-conversation. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The sound of laughter died instantly. At the center of it all sat Colonel Arthur Hale, 83 years old, his silver hair gleaming under the sunlight streaming through the tall cafeteria windows. His chest, though slightly sunken with age, still bore rows of gleaming medals, each one earned through courage, pain, and loyalty. He had just been enjoying his morning coffee, quietly smiling at the chatter of his fellow veterans. Now, his calm eyes lifted toward the tall young officer towering above him. Lieutenant Carson stood stiff, his uniform crisp, his posture full of arrogance rather than pride. With a smirk, he reached out and snatched the old man's cap from the table, holding it high between two fingers like something unworthy of respect. "You call yourself a soldier wearing these outdated badges?" he said, circling Arthur like a predator sizing up its prey. "This is a military cafeteria, not a retirement home for relics." Gasps rippled through the room. Arthur's old friends, men who had once charged through smoke and fire, sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two. One of them, trembling, whispered, "Lieutenant, that's Colonel Hale, retired, decorated for valor at Red Ridge." Carson snorted. "Decorated? For what, surviving?" The old man's jaw tightened. Slowly he set his cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "Son," he said in a calm, measured voice, "watch your tone." "Son?" Carson repeated mockingly, stepping closer. "You think age gives you the right to talk down to me?" "I serve this country now, not 50 years ago when battles were fought with rusty rifles." Arthur's eyes stayed locked on him, steady, unflinching. "Respect isn't about when you served, Lieutenant. It's about how you serve." That only made the young officer angrier. With a smug grin, Carson leaned in and placed the cap mockingly atop Arthur's head, tilting it sideways. The insult was deliberate. Laughter, uneasy and forced, broke out from two young recruits sitting nearby. Everyone else sat in horrified silence. The sound of the lieutenant's belt buckle glinting under the lights only deepened the tension. Arthur slowly removed the cap, set it down in front of him, and looked up at the man standing over him. "You've just dishonored your uniform, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "Someday that will catch up to you," Carson scoffed, folding his arms. "And who's going to make that happen? You?" Arthur didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the large wall clock ticking above the door. Its second hand moved steadily, unbothered by the chaos below. 10 minutes later, that clock would witness something no one in that cafeteria would ever forget. But for now, the silence was deafening. Carson, still puffed up with authority, took a step back and waved dismissively. "Finish your coffee, Grandpa. Try not to embarrass the uniform any more than you already have." As he turned to leave, Arthur called out softly, "You know, arrogance is a poor substitute for honor." The lieutenant paused. His jaw flexed, but he didn't look back. He stormed toward the counter, muttering curses under his breath. The veterans slowly resumed talking, but the air was thick, uneasy, bitter. A few of them reached out to Arthur, asking if he was all right. He simply nodded, his trembling hands wrapping around the cup once more. One of them whispered, "You shouldn't have to endure that, Colonel." Arthur smiled faintly. He's just a boy who's forgotten where the uniform comes from. Life has a way of reminding men like him. Outside, the low hum of engines approached the base gate. A black sedan rolled in, its tires crunching over the gravel. The guard at the entrance saluted sharply as it passed. Inside, Lieutenant Carson leaned against the counter, bragging to a pair of recruits. "That's what's wrong with these old-timers," he said. "They think medals make them untouchable. Newsflash, this is a new era." The recruits nodded nervously, neither daring to contradict him. Suddenly, a young private ran in from the hallway, breathless. "Lieutenant Carson!" Carson frowned. "What is it?" The private straightened his posture, chest heaving. "General Marcus Hale just arrived at the base." He's coming this way. The lieutenant froze. His smirk faltered. The recruits exchanged uneasy looks. General Hale? Carson repeated, blinking. As in, the General Hale? The private nodded. Yes, sir. He's here to meet his father. A heavy silence dropped over the room like a curtain. At the far end of the cafeteria, Arthur Hale set his cap neatly beside his coffee cup and looked toward the entrance, a quiet understanding in his eyes. Outside, the sound of boots striking the floor grew louder, measured, commanding, unmistakably authoritative. Lieutenant Carson straightened his posture, tugged at his collar, and turned toward the door. The moment the door swung open, the air shifted. General Marcus Hale stepped inside, and everyone stood. The moment General Marcus Hale entered the cafeteria, the air grew heavy with reverence. His presence carried the kind of authority that needed no announcement, tall, composed, and wrapped in a quiet power that demanded respect. Every soldier in the room rose instinctively, their chairs scraping against the tiled floor as if choreographed by fear and admiration. His uniform was immaculate, the medals on his chest gleaming beneath the cafeteria lights. But what caught everyone's attention was the look in his eyes, calm, sharp, and unreadable. This was a man who had seen both the glory and the cost of war. Lieutenant Blake Carson's throat went dry. He snapped to attention so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. "Gee, General Hale, sir," he stammered, forcing a salute. General Hale's gaze drifted past him, scanning the room with surgical precision, and then his eyes softened, just a fraction, when he spotted his father sitting quietly at the corner table, still holding his half-finished cup of coffee. Arthur Hale, the retired colonel, slowly stood. His old back straightened out of habit, and his wrinkled face broke into a small smile. "Marcus," he said simply. The general's expression shifted. Warmth flashed in his eyes, but only for a second. He returned his father's smile with a nod before looking around the room once more. Something was off. He could feel it. No one was talking. The silence wasn't the respectful kind. It was thick, uncomfortable, crawling with guilt. He turned back toward Lieutenant Carson, who stood as rigid as a statue, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. "At ease, Lieutenant," the general said in a calm, measured tone. Carson relaxed, but only slightly. "Yes, sir. Welcome back to the base, General Hale. We weren't expecting—" The general raised a hand. "Save the pleasantries." His tone didn't change, but the weight behind it made every man in the room tense up again. He turned toward his father, his voice softening. "Dad, everything all right?" Arthur's lips curled into a faint smile. "Everything's fine, son. Just a small misunderstanding," but the trembling hand that lifted the coffee cup said otherwise. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. A lifetime in command had trained him to read people, their fear, their shame, their lies. He could tell that his father was covering for someone, and the subtle shifting of boots behind him told him exactly who that someone was. He turned his gaze toward Carson. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "were you involved in this misunderstanding?" Carson hesitated. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. "Sir, I was just—" One of the older veterans, unable to stay silent any longer, rose from his seat. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "your father was disrespected." A murmur rippled through the room. Carson's face drained of color. The general's eyes snapped back to him. "Disrespected?" Arthur tried to interject. "Marcus, it's not worth—" But the general didn't let him finish. His voice dropped an octave. "Lieutenant Carson," he said quietly, dangerously, "what did you say to my father?" The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't know who he was. That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was unbearable. Carson's lips trembled, his pride deflating under the general's gaze. "Sir, I may have spoken out of turn. The man was wearing an outdated uniform, and General Hale's voice cut through him like a blade. "That man," he said sharply, "earned those medals before you were even born. He led men through Red Ridge. He pulled soldiers out of fire while you were still learning how to salute. You think you can mock that?" Every word hit like thunder. The recruits sitting near the counter straightened, their eyes wide. Carson's mouth opened, but no words came. General Hale took a step closer. "You wear this uniform," he said, tapping the young man's shoulder, "but you don't understand it. You mistake authority for power, respect for fear." His tone hardened. "You've shamed your rank, Lieutenant." Arthur finally stepped forward, placing a frail hand on his son's arm. Marcus. Enough. The boy made a mistake. Don't destroy his career over it. Marcus looked at his father, the very man who had taught him discipline, compassion, and the meaning of true honor. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. You're right, Dad. He's still a soldier. He'll learn. The relief that flooded Carson's face was short-lived. Lieutenant, Marcus said, turning back to him, you will report to the disciplinary office immediately after this. You'll spend the next 3 months volunteering at the Veterans Ward, cleaning, assisting, listening. Maybe then you'll understand the price of the stripes you wear. Carson's shoulders slumped. Yes, sir. As he walked out, every veteran in the room watched in silence. The humiliation that had once been on Arthur now rested squarely on the lieutenant's back. When the doors closed behind him, the general sat across from his father. You really weren't going to tell me, were you? He asked softly. Arthur smiled faintly, eyes twinkling. I didn't need to. The uniform taught you everything already. Marcus chuckled under his breath. Maybe, but some lessons still need witnesses. The room exhaled, tension melting into relief. The soldiers slowly returned to their meals, their respect for both men deepened. As father and son sat together, their coffee cups side by side, sunlight streamed in through the windows, catching on the old man's medals, turning them into a quiet blaze of gold. Honor. Restored. Lieutenant Blake Carson had never felt smaller in his life. 3 days had passed since the incident at the cafeteria, and each one had dragged like a punishment on its own. The walls of the Veterans Rehabilitation Ward were lined with faded photographs, black and white images of soldiers who had once carried the nation on their backs. He walked through the corridor, his polished boots squeaking faintly against the tiled floor, his uniform stripped of its usual pride. Every step reminded him of what he'd lost, not his rank, but his dignity. General Marcus Hale's voice still echoed in his mind. You mistake authority for power, respect for fear. Carson clenched his jaw, carrying a stack of neatly folded blankets in his arms. The nurse at the counter nodded toward the far end of the hall. Room 12B, Lieutenant. He's waiting for his bed change. He walked briskly down the hallway, pushing open the door with mechanical precision. Inside sat a frail old man in a wheelchair, one arm missing, a quiet smile playing on his wrinkled face. Morning, soldier, the old man said cheerfully. Carson hesitated. Good morning, sir. Sir? The veteran chuckled. I hung up that title long before you were born, kid. Name's Henderson. Call me Hank. The lieutenant placed the blankets on the bed, trying not to meet the man's eyes. I'm here to help with your bedding, Mr. Henderson. The old man studied him for a long moment. You're new. You got that look, like you'd rather be anywhere else. Carson didn't respond. Henderson leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. You one of those who think old soldiers don't matter anymore? That question hit like a punch to the gut. Carson's throat tightened. No, sir. I made a mistake once. Henderson's expression changed. Ah, the kind that ends with you serving coffee to the men who paved your path? Carson nodded faintly. Something like that. For a moment, neither spoke. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. Then Henderson said quietly, You know, Lieutenant, you don't learn respect from medals or lectures. You learn it when you see the cost of what came before you. He turned his gaze toward the window, his one remaining hand trembling slightly as he pointed to a photograph on the wall. A younger version of himself, surrounded by a platoon of men, most of whom never made it home. Carson looked at it, his chest tightening. You served in Red Ridge? Henderson nodded. I did. Under Colonel Arthur Hale. The name made Carson's stomach drop. Henderson smiled wistfully. That man saved my life, twice. He pulled me out of a burning jeep while bullets whistled overhead. You know what he said after that? Carson shook his head. He said, Never forget the men beside you, because rank fades, but brotherhood doesn't. The words cut deep. Carson had mocked that same man just days ago. Now he stood in a hospital room, hearing stories of his courage from those who owed him their lives. For the rest of the morning, Carson worked in silence, changing bedsheets, serving water, helping veterans move between rooms. Each conversation he overheard carried a story, battles fought, friends lost, promises kept. These weren't relics of the past. They were living echoes of the discipline and honor he had taken for granted. By evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Carson found himself sitting alone on a bench outside the ward. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, his hands sore. For the first time, he didn't care about appearances. His mind replayed the cafeteria scene again. The humiliation, the old man's calmness, the disappointment in General Hale's eyes. He exhaled shakily. "I disrespected a hero," he whispered. "You disrespected more than that," a voice said from behind. Carson turned and froze. Standing there, hands clasped behind his back, was General Marcus Hale himself. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes carried a quiet, watching intensity. "Sir," Carson said quickly, rising to attention. "At ease," the general said, stepping closer. "I've been told you've been doing your duty here without complaint." "Yes, sir," Carson replied quietly. "Trying to make up for what I did?" The general nodded slowly, then looked toward the ward's entrance. "Do you know who room 12B belongs to?" "Yes, sir." "A veteran named Henderson." Marcus smiled faintly. "He was under my father's command. He told me about you today, said you were learning fast." Carson's eyes widened slightly. "He did?" The general's voice softened. "He also said something else, that maybe my father was right. Some lessons need to be learned, not taught." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air was quiet except for the distant rustle of flags in the evening wind. Then General Hale said, "You humiliated my father, Lieutenant. But he didn't ask for you to be punished. He asked for you to understand." Carson swallowed hard. "I think I do now, sir." The general looked him in the eye. "Good, because tomorrow morning you'll join the veterans for breakfast. Not to serve them, to sit with them, to listen, to learn." Carson nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Yes, sir." As the general turned to leave, Carson called after him, voice trembling. "Sir, how is the colonel?" Marcus stopped. A faint smile crossed his face. "Proud," he said. "He told me you'd come around." When the general walked away, the lieutenant stood there for a long time, the wind brushing past him, the weight of humility grounding his pride. For the first time, he didn't feel like an officer trying to command respect. He felt like a man trying to earn it. Morning sunlight filtered through the cafeteria windows, the same cafeteria that, only a week ago, had been the scene of Lieutenant Blake Carson's greatest shame. The same polished floor, the same long tables filled with quiet conversation. But today, there was something different in the air, a kind of peace that Carson hadn't felt in years. He stood at the entrance, hands clasped behind his back, his uniform crisp but humble. This time, he hadn't come to command attention. He'd come to earn it. Across the room, the veterans sat in groups, their laughter soft, their stories weaving through the hum of clinking cups and silverware. Among them sat Colonel Arthur Hale, the man Carson had once humiliated. His posture was upright despite his age, his medals catching the light, and his eyes, calm, wise, forgiving, met Carson's from across the room. The lieutenant took a slow breath and walked forward. Every head turned. Whispered murmurs rose around the room. The same soldiers who had witnessed his arrogance now watched his slow, deliberate steps toward the old colonel. Carson stopped at the center of the cafeteria, the very spot where he had once stood towering over an 83-year-old man, cap in hand, full of pride and ignorance. Today, that same cap rested gently in his palms. He looked around at the faces, the veterans, the recruits, and even a few officers who had gathered out of curiosity. Then his voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began softly, "last week I stood here and shamed not only a man but this uniform. I disrespected the very values it was built on: honor, sacrifice, and respect." No one moved. Carson turned to Arthur Hale. "Colonel Hale, I didn't see you then for who you are, a soldier who carried this nation through its darkest hours. I only saw age where there was strength, wrinkles where there was wisdom, and for that, I am deeply sorry." His voice trembled slightly. "But I've spent the last week with men who fought beside you, men who showed me what true leadership looks like, not through authority but through humility. They taught me more about this uniform than years of service ever did." He held out the cap with both hands and lowered his head. "Sir, I came to return what I took, Your Honor, and my respect." The room fell into a stillness so complete that the ticking clock on the wall was the only sound. Arthur Hale stared at the young man for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood. His frail hands reached out and took the cap, not with anger, but with grace. "Lieutenant," he said softly, "the first step to being a good soldier isn't knowing how to command, it's knowing how to apologize." Carson looked up, his eyes glassy. I know that now, sir. Arthur smiled faintly. Then you've already learned what many never do. He placed the cap gently back into Carson's hands. Keep it. Carson froze. Sir? Arthur nodded. You've earned the right to remember this moment. Let it remind you that every uniform you wear, every salute you give, should come from respect, not pride. For a moment the lieutenant stood there speechless. Then he snapped to attention and saluted. Not as a superior officer, but as a soldier paying tribute. Arthur returned the salute with a trembling hand. The veterans, watching silently, began to rise, one by one, until the entire cafeteria was standing. Then came a sound that no one expected, applause. It started softly, then grew louder, steady, powerful, echoing through the hall. The veterans clapped not just for the old man or the young lieutenant, but for what they represented. 2 generations of soldiers, divided by years but united by honor. At that moment, General Marcus Hale stepped into the room, drawn by the sound. He paused at the doorway, taking in the sight of his father and the lieutenant standing together. His lips curved into a proud, quiet smile. Carson turned toward him and saluted sharply. Sir, he said, permission to report that I have completed my lesson. The general's eyes softened. Lesson? Yes, sir, Carson replied. The one your father started and you finished. Marcus chuckled quietly. Permission granted, Lieutenant. He glanced at his father. Seems you're still teaching, old man. Arthur grinned. The army might retire me, son, but life never does. The cafeteria filled with gentle laughter, the kind that breaks tension and heals wounds. The general joined his father at the table, while Carson helped serve coffee, not out of obligation but out of respect. When he poured a cup for Arthur, the old man caught his wrist and said quietly, You'll make a fine leader one day, Blake. Not because you're perfect, but because you remember what it feels like to fail. Carson nodded, emotion thick in his voice. I won't forget, sir. As the day went on, the cafeteria returned to its normal rhythm. Stories, laughter, camaraderie. But something profound had shifted. The young soldiers who witnessed it would carry that moment for the rest of their lives. Outside, the flag waved in the cool morning breeze, a symbol of everything that bound them together: duty, honor, and forgiveness. And as the camera of this story would slowly pan out, we'd see the young lieutenant and the old colonel sitting together, sharing a quiet cup of coffee, not as strangers from 2 eras, but as brothers in arms. Honor lost. Lesson learned. Respect restored.